Great. So, hi, everyone. Excited to be here today. This is airing on Yom HaAtzmaut. So, Chag Sameach, happy Yom HaAtzmaut to everyone in advance. I'm Rabbi Wendy Geffen. Very excited to be here today with Jack Elbaum and Blake Flayton. So, in the sort of framework of North Shore Congregation Israel, our connection here is with Jack Elbaum, who is a child of North Shore Congregation Israel, although he is no longer a child, certainly an adult in his own right, a college student at George Washington University, along with Blake, who I'll introduce in a moment. Jack is well known to many of us from North Shore Congregation Israel, and if you are viewing this and you're not from NSCI, he's someone who should be well known to you or should become that way. Gosh, Jack, what can I say about you? There's a lot to say about you. You graduated from Highland Park High School last year and now find yourself very, very active at George Washington University in a year when I cannot imagine it has been easy to be very, very active on campus, as it were. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Most importantly, for people who are watching, I want to make sure that you know that Jack is really a well-known and becoming even more well-known writer and writes really prolifically for any number of news sources: Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, the Washington Examiner, the Forward, Times of Israel. And I just saw this last week, you had your inaugural post in the New York Post. So it's exciting for me as one of your rabbis and fans to get to see this blossoming writing thing you have going on, as well as your opinions are really valued and profound. So excited to be here with Jack. And then I'll also introduce Blake Flayton, who is newer to me, but I'm excited to get to know him through Jack, who introduced us. Blake is a senior at George Washington University, majoring in political communication. He's currently writing his thesis on Jeremy Corbyn and the anti-Semitism crisis in the British Labour Party. I'm sorry that you have to write a thesis about that, but I think it's excellent that you are doing that. Blake is the co-founder of the New Zionist Congress, and this is really what brings us all together here today. And this is an organization that seeks to educate the next generation of Jewish leaders on Judaism, Israel, and anti-Semitism. Blake's a speaker and a writer also on Jewish political issues with bylines in the New York Times, Tablet Magazine, Haaretz, The Forward, and more. So both of you, Jack, Blake, thank you so much for agreeing to be in conversation with me and to really bring your experience, your knowledge, your opinions forward to our community and anyone else who chooses to join us. I think they really help to add dimension to something that I think for a lot of people, there's not a lot of awareness that any kind of dimensionality exists or is possible. So thanks for that. I think just to get started, I wonder if you could each just share with us a little bit about your experience. I'm going to use the phrase on campus, but I guess I use that in its most expansive sense. Generally speaking, and then I guess with the particular lens toward being Jewish, identifying as Zionist, and kind of what that experience has been like, maybe some highlights or challenges or both. Whoever wants to go first, feel free.
Jack, go ahead.
All righty, sure. So, I mean, like you talked about in your introduction, obviously I'm a freshman. I've not actually been on campus yet, though. Right from the time, like, obviously college started, I've gotten involved with sort of Israel activism and also Jewish life on campus. I'm a part of the GW for Israel chapter. I'm co-director of political affairs there. However, I think that part of being online has resulted in I've not actually had probably nearly as much of the experience of necessarily anti-Semitism or anything like that on campus to the extent that I think Blake has. That's not to say I've not seen it. Like, a brief example is that last week was Israel Apartheid Week on the same exact week as Yom HaShoah, or obviously I've had comments saying, oh, all Jews are rich and that sort of stuff. But I think that a couple reasons why that might be is one, obviously online. Another is that some of the political spaces that I put myself in are not necessarily ones where Israel is really a third rail issue. Because I know that there are many clubs where uh, it's really too touchy of an issue to even bring up because it will result in really intense fighting, names being thrown back and forth, and all of that. However, even though I don't necessarily have the overwhelming personal experience with anti-Semitism on campus, there have been far too many stories with people like Blake, people like Rose Rich at USC, people like Max Price at Tufts, who have been explicitly attacked due to their pro-Israel stances and, by extension, their Jewishness. And so, when you sort of see this attack going on and campuses across the country, it was not necessarily an option to say, oh, I'm going to sit on the sideline for this one. Rather, I felt it necessary to sort of throw myself right in the middle of it.
Yeah, I think Jack really brought up a great point that, if you're removed from or not removed, but if you're not really involved in very progressive spaces in high school and in college, Israel doesn't really show itself as a third rail issue. It's not really a point of contention or a point of controversy, but it is a point of contention and controversy in leftist spaces. And the reason why I went to GW, why I decided to apply to DC schools, was because I wanted more than anything in the world to be a progressive activist. I wanted to intern for my congressman. I wanted to be a part of left-wing organizations. I wanted to go to protests and rallies every weekend. And in fact, I did. In high school, I was the chairman of the Young Democrats Society of my chapter in Scottsdale, Arizona. So I was very involved. I wanted to work on the Elizabeth Warren campaign, et cetera. And throughout my freshman year, I experienced multiple things, not only at school, but also at work and also at rallies. Comments that were made, things that were said to me and to others, or just the way that certain organizations were running themselves and organizing their meetings that just seemed very hostile to Israel and to Zionists in a way that couldn't be explained by political criticism. They weren't saying things like Israel should, end the occupation of the West Bank, or Israel should lift the blockade of Gaza, or even Israel should grant the right of return for Palestinian refugees, which is a separate issue entirely. But it was very Soviet in the way in which they were saying Zionism is racism, Zionism is fascism, genocide, apartheid, all of the worst characteristics that we could attribute to a thing, to an entity, to a political ideology. And not only that, but several organizations on my campus, many of which had nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at all, kept on finding ways to bring in condemnations of Israel into their platform. So I was at a protest for labor rights and for paying GW workers a higher minimum wage. And the organizations who were a part of that found a way to tie Israel into it and say, janitors not making enough money at GW is equivalent to how Israel is treating the Palestinians in the West Bank. Or the LGBTQ organization on campus writing in their platform that they were against settler colonialism, that they weren't going to partner with any organization that supported settler colonialism, which obviously means Hillel, which is the largest Jewish organization on campus. Meaning that they were not going to associate themselves with them or partner with them, or a climate advocacy organization writing a statement condemning the IHRA resolution, definition of anti-Semitism. So all of these things really confused me and made me think that, do I not have a place? Because I'm a Zionist, because I'm a proud, pro-Israel Jew, do I not have a place in any of these spaces? And all kind of reached a crescendo when in September of 2019, during my sophomore year, when this student was following another student down the hall, and they were both, kind of tipsy. They had been to some dorm room party or wherever. And the person behind the camera said, "What are we going to do to Israel?" And the student is kind of laughing, and she kind of trips over herself, and she says, "Yo, we're going to bomb Israel, you Jewish pieces of S word." And that exploded on campus and really put things in perspective that, oh no, this is a major problem.
Yeah, and actually, I just want to add one more thing to Blake's point. That, I mean, it was just last week or maybe 2 weeks ago where there was an environmentalist group on campus which had an entire event dedicated to Israel and the Palestinian issue. And so I think that what's really pernicious about what a lot of these people are doing is that they're couching anti-Zionism in the terms of social justice, anti-racism, standing up for like the marginalized, things like that. And so it's very easy to prey on people who have instincts that say, absolutely, I obviously want to stand up for the oppressed people of the world, the marginalized people of the world. And so that's how they are putting these ideas into people who otherwise would not necessarily think of Israel as an issue that they necessarily want to get involved in.
We can't hear you.
I just want to thank you. Zoom, no matter how much you do it, there's always that mute button. So it's interesting to think about this point exactly in terms of its ramifications, I think outside of the Jewish community, but then also inside of the Jewish community. And so for our purposes right now, I still want to keep it tight to internal to the Jewish community. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts, each of your thoughts really, on the line or the conversation about whether or not to delineate between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And I'm curious to hear how each of you approaches that, just as a person, as a student, as a Jew, as a pro-Israel Zionist person, how you identify and discern or don't between these two ideas. I don't know, Jack, if you want to go first, since you went first on the last one, we'll just keep in the same order, maybe.
Sure, I can definitely go first. So, I mean, I think that very often anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are one and the same, because I think that anti-Zionism is really built on a more or less ridiculous double standard that every single country in the world has the right not only to exist, but thrive, despite any issues they may have. Because, as we all know, countries all around the world have horrible issues. Only 40% of people in the world are actually living in free countries. And so there's obviously no shortage of issues in any countries around the world. So they all have the right to exist and thrive despite any of that, except for one state. And that's, of course, the Jewish state. So it seems a little bit outlandish to me that we can somehow separate that double standard from the actual character of that one country that they say it's actually, they don't have the right to exist. Now, I personally will not say that all anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitism, though, because I think that if you do that, then the burden of proof is on you to show that every single example of it actually is anti-Semitism, when I think that there actually are some examples where it might not be the case, because there are some people who truly believe that. I'll just take one example. So, I mean, the IHRA definition says that if you believe that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor, then that constitutes anti-Semitism. However, there are plenty of people, especially, in Blake and I's demographic, who not only believe that Israel is a racist endeavor, but their ideology holds that the United States is a racist endeavor. They hold that countries all around Europe are racist endeavors. And then just as an extension of that, they say Israel is a racist endeavor as well. Now, I think that many times people actually go farther with Israel, which will then put them back into the anti-Semitic range. However, there are some few examples where it's not, though I think many times it is.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I want to come back to in a moment that idea of where does the burden rest? Who's responsible for the burden of proving, of defending, and I think that'll move us forward in a minute into sort of why is it that this new Zionist Congress is coming to be in your mind. So thank you so much for that, Jack. I want to give Blake a turn also.
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I think Jack said everything super, super well. I think the articulation of that is pitch perfect. I would just add on to it by saying that anti-Zionism right now is not presenting itself in the sort of Peter Beinart academic, intellectual hypothesizing about what the best solution is to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is not saying, let's use the tools of teamwork and political organizing and human rights accountability in order to create a sustainable atmosphere where both Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace, regardless of how fruitless I believe those efforts would be, or misguided I believe those intentions are, and also either intentionally or inadvertently hostile to the Jewish people. And like Jack said, implying double standards onto us. Like, why can't we have a country? Why can't we defend ourselves on our own territory after 2,000 years of the most heinous and violent oppression that this world has ever seen? But anti-Zionism is not presenting itself as that. It is presenting itself as attaching the idea of the Jewish nation to, like I said before, the most detestable traits on earth. It is singling out Israel and holding it responsible for everything that us as, I'm speaking for myself here, us as left-leaning people deem most vile. So racism, genocide, apartheid, etc. And singling out Israel as the reason why things are going wrong in the United States. You know, Tufts University, 70+% of the student body voted yes on a resolution to condemn the deadly exchange, which is a campaign initiated by Jewish groups, Jewish anti-Zionist groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, to tie racist police brutality in the United States to Israel, to say that Israel, because there's a co-sponsorship counterterrorism program that the ADL constructs between American police officers and Israeli police officers, that Israel is responsible for the death of George Floyd, or Israel had something to do with it. And that's something you heard in a lot of Black Lives Matter protests and in a lot of social justice spaces too, where people will talk about rights for LGBTQ people and then say, you know, Israel is an apartheid state that uses pink washing, props up its treatment of its gay citizens in order to undermine its treatments of the Palestinians. And so it's dragged into every single issue: reproductive rights, criminal justice reform, campaign finance reform. Like, I can go on and on. It all comes back to Israel. And we have to ask ourselves, okay, so this isn't some political campaign in order to make a more just and sustainable future for both Jews and Palestinians in between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. This is a very coordinated effort with historical precedent to single out Israel, to point the finger at the Jews as a collective people and say, they are to blame for whatever we're experiencing right now. They are the reason why all of these terrible things exist in the world. It is their sins. It is their, transgressions that are the reason why we're in the place we are today. And I will also say about anti-Zionism in general is that it's very helpful because it forges a coalition like nothing else. You know, the Arab League in 1945, how did they come together? You know, despite all of the different political trials and tribulations in their own states, how did they come together to form a pact? By one agreement: opposition to Israel, no Jewish state. How did, you know, various peoples, communists, capitalists, nationalists, internationalists, wealthy people, poor people in Europe all come together to vote for a single candidate? It was the Jewish question, making Jews the scapegoat for why, you know, life was hard in particular circumstances. And that's exactly what we're seeing on college campuses today. It's using Zionism, which at this point, I'm sure Jack and I agree with, shouldn't even be a question. The Jewish state exists. We're not in a cafe in Vienna in 1920 discussing what the best solution to the Jewish question is. It's been answered. It's singling out this specific self-determination movement and making it the subject in order to distract from other problems.
Yeah, thank you. You know, it's interesting, having been a rabbi for the last 20 years, but an involved Jewish person and a person who identifies personally as Zionist as well. It's been interesting to watch the evolution of what feels like a shift, in particular in progressive circles on campus. I would say that's been heightened over the last decade. If I had to just sort of track back in my own experience of kind of shepherding students off to college and then listening to them come back with their response. And one of the interesting things that I've observed over the last decade or so certainly more intensified over the last 5 years, is that we've had kids who are super active Jews, pro-Israel, and I'm not going to define what pro-Israel means. They would define, what pro-Israel looked like for each of them might really vary, but they would self-define as Zionist or pro-Israel, right? Go to college, really excited, and then they would encounter, in particular in social justice circles, but also in academics, in their academic environment. So outside of student organization, in the academic construct, they would encounter this different narrative, this different messaging, whether it was being forced upon them, whether they were being called to fight against it, whether they really wanted to have a seat at the table, so they were willing to stomach it, or just sort of quiet their identity so they could retain the seat. And what I've watched happen is, over the years, the result has been most students have said, you know what, it's not worth it, forget it. And they step away from Israel. They step away from their Jewish identity entirely. Often they step away from the progressive social justice circles too. They just want nothing to do with any of it. It leaves such a bad taste in their mouth, I guess I would say, just from observing. Blake, one of the things I read in your recent Tablet article was you framed it as the "don't go there" message. That this sort of idea of any time one might want to counter message or dialogue about critique or hypocrisy that they might see being presented, the response, at least according to your experience, is often just don't go there. I wonder if you could speak a little to that, Blake, and then Jack, I'm curious about your thoughts on this too. This idea of the established group, whatever that might be, trying to say, okay, yes, there might be a hypocrisy, but the solution is let's just not go there. Let's just not talk about this. Why do you have to keep bringing it up?
Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak to that a bit.
So what I will say is that what happens, and this is something I always say, what happens when a lot of Jewish freshmen show up to campus, who align themselves as most American Jews do, upwards of 75% of us voted for Democrats through 2016 through 2020. And so a lot of times they have these liberal values and they arrive to campus and they want to get involved in the progressive movement. And they go to a club fair and they see, a Green New Deal, and they say, yes, that's important to me. They see raising the minimum wage, and yes, that's important to me too. Student debt, all of the issues that we all care about. And then they see, the Students for Justice in Palestine, the anti-Zionist wing of the progressive movement. And they think to themselves, well, hold on. If I agree with these people on A through Y, I must agree with them on Z as well, Z meaning Zionism, because why wouldn't I? They're my ideological compatriots. We're in this struggle together. We agree on everything else. Why would I disagree with them? So they think to themselves, well, then it must be me who's been brainwashed. It's been me who's been brainwashed by my Jewish family, by my rabbi, by my community leaders growing up into thinking that Israel was good and that Israel was something that I had to support. And so they succumb to it, either for simply political reasons, like I just discussed, or because it's for social reasons. I want to be friends with the people who go to protests on Fridays and Saturdays. I want to be friends with the people, who organize political action on campus. And so why would I talk about that or make that a point of contention when I can just stay silent about it? And then other kids who can't stay silent about it, either because of their own challenging personal experiences, because of hearing off-kilter comments that they knew crossed a line, will just tap out. And because they don't have the words and the education and the tools in order to effectively combat it, because they hear words from the pro-Israel side like self-determination, indigeneity, 1948, 1967, political Zionism, Theodore Herzl, and then the other side they hear apartheid, binationalism, imperialism, colonialism, and they're very overwhelmed. And that is a lot of subject matter. And so I don't blame the Jewish students who say, you know what, time out, I call quits. I can't get involved in any of this because it's so hard. And also it's a thankless job to be a Jewish advocate because I mean, I've lost friends. I've lost a lot of my clout on campus. Not that I've had any to begin with, but there's a lot of things to sacrifice. And so the don't go there is very pervasive because it's the easy way out.
Yeah, it's reminding me actually over these past few years how often I get a call from a student, often a freshman, who got themselves, they went to Hillel, was like the first thing they did, and then all of a sudden they found out that there was some sort of student government driven BDS sort of bill or rule or whatever legislative agenda it is that's being brought up to the school, and that there's going to be a hearing, and their Hillel executive director or rabbi has asked them to testify on behalf of Israel, and they'll call me often and they'll be like, what am I supposed to say? I went with you to Israel when I was a sophomore and I loved it. Like they're not empowered, and all of a sudden they're being asked to defend Israel's right to exist. Mm-hmm. And it falls on their shoulder. And I think for some, this is an enlivening process, but for many, it is daunting, overwhelming, and it does, connect deeply to their Jewish identity in a way that isn't an academic exercise being explored, but is deeply personal, and they are being confronted in a place of conflict around it, which I would argue they shouldn't have to be put in that position. Jack, any thoughts on that? I just don't want to block you out of that conversation.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that it definitely manifests as a self-perpetuating cycle, because I mean, if however many freshman Jews who come in, say they're pro-Israel, they end up tapping out, say, no, I don't want to be a part of this debate, then what does that mean for the next group of freshmen that come in? If there's less people advocating for the interests of Jews on campus, if there's less people advocating for Israel's right to exist, then I mean, there's not going to be the infrastructure necessary to actually support the next group of pro-Israel Jewish students that actually might want to get involved. However, when there's not that infrastructure, they might be scared and then tap out as well. And then that'll keep on going and keep on going.
Right, great. So thank you. That's a perfect segue to, so what does it mean to create infrastructure that ensures that there will be a continuing place for pro-Israel Jewish students on campus? So I want to talk about the new Zionist Congress, which, I'll just say, like, out of total naivete, I was just reading Tablet magazine one day, came across Blake's article, which if you haven't read, you should. I'll actually post a link up to that article in this feed. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. It's happening at GW. I know Jack Elbaum. And so out of just hope, I contacted Jack to say, hey, do you know about this? And Jack was like, yeah, I'm totally involved in this thing. And I know the author of that article, Blake. So what I haven't shared with you both is that besides college students often reaching out to me for like what to do, how to find a place for themselves, there are a lot of older people I'm going to call them my contemporaries, who are not quite old enough to be your parents, but are getting there. And then your parents' contemporaries, and even like your grandparents' contemporaries, who are just despondent over the situation when it comes to pro-Israel Jewish life on campus. And they feel that it is something about which there is no escape. That it's a situation that will only continue to go downhill and will never lead to any sort of restoration or promise. And I have forwarded them your Tablet article and told them about the new Zionist Congress as a way to say, hey, look, the college students are figuring this out for themselves. So I want you to tell us about the new Zionist Congress. Tell us what brought it to be. Tell us what you want it to be. and then share with us what we, the older folks, can do to support your efforts.
I think, well, first of all, so thank you for all those kind words about the organization and really what its goal is. New Zionist Congress started because a couple of college students, Jack included, we got together a couple months ago, and we basically been having these brainstorming sessions about, why is this getting worse? Why is this virulent anti-Zionism, anti-Israel activism getting worse? And not only on college campuses, but we find that the kids who are marinating in the ideology that Zionism is racism, therefore Zionists are racist, therefore they deserve to be treated horribly on campus, they're not checking those beliefs at the door once they leave college. They are entering our most trusted institutions, media, politics, law, entertainment, and they're changing the way that Israel is viewed, and they're creating a rather hostile atmosphere for pro-Israel people. And like you, I don't really like the term pro-Israel, because if I was French, would I say pro-France?
Right.
Or right. If I was Indian, when I say pro-India, that doesn't make any sense. It's a country. You support the right of it to exist. But so New Zionist Congress started off as, how do we equip Jewish young people who are tapping out, who are not wanting to engage in this conversation because it's too complicated? How do we equip them with the education and the resources that'll help them fight back and push back against this type of advocacy? And it also was kind of a reaction to what has been a Jewish community response lately, which is try to reason with them. Try to sit at their table, try to, if they don't understand, if they're calling, Zionist a genocidal evil ideology and blaming Israel for all the problems in the world, try to explain to them how much your cousin's bar mitzvah in front of the Western Wall meant to you. Try to explain to them how magical your birthright trip was, or your family's history in coming to Israel or America. And it's not working for some very dark, twisted reason that I think we could, spend hours talking about. But for now, I'll just say it's not working because I think there's an ideology behind far left progressive activism that is just inherently hostile to Jewish particularism and to Jews in general.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that has to do with critical theory. And just the new dogmas that we are incorporating into our culture about who is oppressed and who is oppressive, and therefore who has greater access to truth and who doesn't, and who needs to shut up and let others talk. And that's the ideology that's guiding all of these movements. And there hasn't been an organized Jewish force to push back on it and to say, no, we are confident being Zionist Jews, and we're not going to sacrifice any part of ourselves to fit in. Because if you didn't accept us in the first place, we are kind of not trusting that you're ever going to accept us regardless of what we do. So that's what NZC is for. And it seeks to empower students by reading Zionist literature, by engaging in Zionist authors and writers and speakers. It seeks to provide kind of firsthand tangible knowledge about the Jewish experience and Jewish history. And in the future, we really want representation at the World Zionist Congress. We want to organize trips to Israel. We want to devise political campaigns to push back around things like school curriculums that enforce or teach critical theory in the classroom. And overall, we want to provide a space for students and young people from across the political spectrum, from across the ideological spectrum, to find a home in Jewish self-determination. And my tablet piece ended with, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Right. And that's exactly our mantra going forward.
Yeah, Jack, tell us a little bit about sort of your experience with the formation of New Zionist Congress as well, and your view on this.
Yeah, so I think that Blake got a lot of it. And the one thing that I just want to stress is how much New Zionist Congress is really about education. Because when many people, let's say they go to college or anything like that, they think they're pro-Israel, they're not really sure, they don't know that much about it. So obviously when they're confronted with these horrible accusations, they don't necessarily always know how to respond. But through various things, we put out 3 Zionist works of the week where people can read good stuff. And we have a book club that I'm running with Blake, where you're able to read both early Zionist texts and more contemporary issues. And if I may just plug it, the next one is on April 22nd. We're reading War of Return by Adi Schwartz and Einat Wilf. And great book, highly recommend it. That's happening on April 22nd on Clubhouse. And so we're actually having conversations about the important controversial issues that you're going to need to know about if you're actually going to want to be an advocate, be someone who's knowledgeable about the issues. So I think that's one thing that New Zionist Congress is very valuable in doing, actually educating young people.
Yeah, exactly. And I just want to, like, going off of what Jack said, like, we realized in organizing this group, this movement, that there was just an obscene lack of cultural literacy happening, where no one really reads Herzl. And our first book club was Der Judenstaat, which is the pamphlet that kind of founded modern political Zionism. Although there's been some debate about that, because of course there's debate in the Jewish community. No one is reading the life and times of Golda Meir and David Ben Gurion and Natan Sharansky. No one is engaging in this work in the way that it can inform contemporary activism, and we believe that to be essential.
Yeah, I think that the importance of creating a platform or a format for that sort of education is critical on a number of levels. Also, just developmentally, I don't know many, kids when they're preparing for bar or bat mitzvah, for example, who would be ready to be thinking about exploring these kind of ideas. I think, it is this interesting question. I think about this as a representative of a very established Jewish synagogue, right? In terms of what should we be doing? What should we be doing differently to make it so that the baseline when a child becomes a young adult and goes onto campus is elevated to a different point than maybe it has been for a while? Because, as a rabbi, I don't want a student's or a person's only knowledge of Israel, only profound knowledge of Israel, to be their birthright trip, to be their 10th grade summer Israel trip, which is wonderful and personal. But it cuts out the history, the narratives, and the complexities that's true for any issue, and then actually deepens one's ultimate way of connecting with Zionism one way or another. So I applaud you for really stepping into that. I think it's critically important. What would you say to like people like me, to the Jewish establishment, as it were, as an invitation to help you? What would you like to see the Jewish establishment do differently?
I would say to focus on education in a revamped way, in a new way. Don't just teach kids to support Israel. Teach them why to support Israel. Don't just teach kids Jewish history. Teach them why we learn about Jewish history and why it means so much today to have knowledge of the Farhud and the pogroms and the Holocaust and the Enlightenment and the Inquisition, everything and anything in the breadth of our story. Don't just give kids a surface level understanding of Israel. Teach them what the Knesset is. Teach them what political parties in Israel stand for, what annexation is, what the occupation is, what Gaza is. Teach them about Soviet anti-Semitism, not just Nazi anti-Semitism. Teach them about Ben Yehuda and the rebirth of a Jewish language and the amazingness of that. Teach them about survivors and listening to survivors, and also about the works of Shalom Aleichem and the books of the 20th century and 18th and 19th. And there's so much culture and things there, and that will inform people to recognize quote unquote anti-Zionism, which Jack and I have established as all too often anti-Semitism, a lot easier, because it's an affront to our story. It's an affront to our understanding of ourselves. And in order to recognize threats, you need to have a better understanding of what threatens you.
Yeah, and this might just be a different way of putting it, but I think that much of the strategy right now is more of a defensive strategy. You need a proactive strategy, an offensive strategy. And that's exactly what Blake was just describing, because the only way that you're ever going to win hearts and minds, not only among the Jewish community, but in the larger political space, is to actually have a proactive long-term strategy that is not always just either about the surface level or on the defensive.
Yeah, I think, Blake, it was in your article where you talked about the price of sitting at the table, and then you said that's not a price you want to pay.
No.
And it resonated. That stays with me. It resonated deeply personally for me, and I think for many. And it's that idea of carrying. It isn't. I don't believe it should be on us to carry a burden of proof, a burden of defense. It is on us to express and utilize the freedom and right of self-determination that we have, to be proud of who we are, to be proud of the heritages that we carry, and invested in those. So I really commend you for really taking these steps forward to make this possible. So one last question. It's 10 years from now. You both have probably multiple graduate level degrees and are doing fabulous things in the world in different ways. I think it's probably fair for me to say that, like, for our audience, these two individuals, have very different, like, political viewpoints, personally, are diverse in their own kind of expression of themselves and Judaism, but are aligned, and are here today talking about this same cause. So I just want to say, for anyone who's listening, that there is space in this for anyone who is interested in creating an environment that is healthy and nourishing for Jewish, or I guess I'll just call them Zionists, and whoever identifies that way, in particular on campus, but maybe in the broader circle. I guess I just want to sort of name that in case someone's watching and sort of says, well, this is just for progressive kids or something like that. I just want to make that clear, that we're actually, this is focused around something that happens on campus, typically in progressive circles, and that's where this narrative is coming from. But it impacts all Zionist Jewish students in some way, shape, or form. And I just kind of want to name that. But it's 10 years from now. You're both professionals in the world doing amazing things, and everyone's going to be amazed by you. And God willing, the new Zionist Congress will not be so new, and it will be continuing. What in your mind does that look like?
We want to set up community chapters and have individual communities across the United States and, in fact, the world. We already have people applying for leadership from the UK, from France, from Canada, from Buenos Aires, which is incredible. We want to set up these spaces across the world where people can engage in their own kind of mini book clubs, their own mini discussions on Zionist thought, their own mini political campaigns and advocacy work. And then as a movement, as an international movement, like I said, we want representation at the seat of the table where decisions are being made for the future of the Jewish people. We want establishment Jewish organizations to listen to us. And we take pride in this kind of young, scrappy punk rock vibe to this sort of work. But in the end, we want that to be influential enough to where ideas come across. We want to go to Israel. There's several people on leadership, myself included, who are going to make Aliyah very, very soon. And we want to create not just an organization, but an inspirational way for people, young people, old people, everywhere in between, to get involved in a movement that honors Jewish self-determination and that actively, not passively, pushes back against anti-Semitism, even if it doesn't present itself clearly as anti-Semitism. And we have specific projects coming up that I can't give too much away about, but they're definitely going to boost our image and I think make a lot of people more excited. And the support we've gotten already is very overwhelming, and from you and individual synagogues as well. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Jack?
Yeah, so I mean, we've talked a lot about how Blake and I's generation is increasingly anti-Israel, hostile towards Israel, and then Jews in general, actually. And so I think that if New Zionist Congress is truly successful, it'll help turn the tide on that and try to make it so we understand that looking for the dissolution of the only Jewish state is not the epitome of social justice. Rather, it is a massive injustice. And so it's about changing the narrative. It's about changing the conversation. And so if we can help turn the tide in that direction, then that'll be something great as well.
Yeah, that will be something great. That would be amazing. So, and I think if anybody can do it, you can do it. So thank you on behalf of all of us who've gotten to be a part of this conversation with you, for inspiring in the work that you do, and reminding us that, if you will, it is no dream, that you can make these things real. So for those who are watching who are interested in learning more about New Zionist Congress, you can go to their website, newzionist.org, and sign up to be a member. You can follow them on Twitter at New Zionist, and you can follow them on Instagram at New Zionist Congress. And that they're doing stuff on Clubhouse as well. So if you are one of the lucky holders of a membership on Clubhouse, or whatever it's called these days, you can likely find these gentlemen there, among others, and probably call into some of their programs. I'm going to call into that book discussion. So
and if you don't have Clubhouse, there's a Zoom link that I know Blake sets up.
Yes, there's Zoom links. If you're not an iPhone user, you can always join our meetings. We send a Zoom link every Sunday in our weekly newsletter, which you can sign up to join on our website, newzionist.org.
Perfect. Totally inclusive. Good job. Thank you so much for taking the time, gentlemen, for being with us. And we look forward to seeing everything that you're going to make possible. Thank you so much.